and welcome to the Grid Podcast, your podcast about our electricity networks in Great Britain and their heart at the transition to electrification. So we are back today. I'm Brian Murhead, regular co-host, alongside Dave McDonald, our regular co-host.
Hello.
And today we are talking all things connection reform as part of our Capacity Crunch mini-series. So in the last episode, we did a bit of a state of play in May, which was an update on what the capacity crunch looks like. So around some of the numbers and the congestion. Well, not so much on our grid, more in the connection queue to get onto our grid. Basically outlining the numbers and identifying how much of this is a big process issue rather than our lines and wires running hot. So the episode today is all about, how is primarily driven by National Grid, but also backed by government and pretty much everybody else. How are they looking to sort that process issue? And this word connection reform is something you're going to hear a lot about because effectively they are ripping up the rule book and putting a whole new one in place to try and sort it out. So that's the good news.
Might even make the BBC headlines some night.
Yeah, maybe. So to just very quickly recap on how we got here. So we had all the speculation in terms of and genuine interest in electrification, whether that be new generation projects, but also a lot of new demand projects, and effectively this huge connection queue emerging. A large part of that was around how, at transmission level, they really had a lack of process in there and scrutiny. So you didn't even need land rights, never mind planning anything else, and you could book up gigawatts of capacity. Everybody's sort of recognised, that's stopping the shovel-ready or real projects getting through. So this episode's all about connection reform. The ESO has just recently released basically some documents outlining their intentions with this. This follows a lot of different consultations and working groups through the end of last year.
So ESO just...
Electricity System Operator. I'm going to refer to them as ESO because they have been NGESO. They're transitioning actually to the Energy System Operator. That's a whole different thing. So we'll just... ESO is how I'm going to refer to them.
People in charge of the transmission queue then?
Yeah, people in charge of the transmission queue is a good way. But yeah, thanks for that, because we do like an acronym. And there's, as part of this, there have been new acronyms made up as well. Everybody will be glad to know. So please do pick me up on that if I jump into acronyms without explaining them. So just quickly before we get into the whole connection reform then, so a couple of positives. Obviously, it's positive to see this. I think everybody's probably agreed that something big needs to happen because it is grinding projects of all sorts. I think we said in the last episode, pretty much if you're developing anything that connects to the grid, whether it be a very small level EV charging or new shop almost, future housing, battery storage, electric vehicle charging, you name it, this is now affecting. I think everybody's broadly agreed on reform is needed.
I think it is that bit though, that it's the wider reform as well and supported by government, because it was always going to need that impetus. I don't think everybody has started to do bits themselves, which we'll probably cover, like what's happened in the last while. But the big change has to have that full force behind it, I think.
Yes, and that's it. So this all come about. It didn't exactly start here, but this is in the context of the Prime Minister of the UK announcing a change in how connections are done from a first come first serve to a first ready first connect type of system, and basically not for now really for the first time we have a bit more detail on what first ready first connect is like a boilerplate political statement that could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. This is the first time we're getting any detail, and that's what we're going to go through today is, what does first ready, first connect mean? And again, a bit of a spoiler alert, we're probably not going to fully answer that question because the detail that has been released doesn't fully cover that yet. But we'll get into that because there's going to be a lot of important consultations and discussion and engagement in this over the next at least 6 months to work out some of the detail, because the devil really is going to be the detail. Before I get into explaining what this is, it's probably just worth touching on what we're not covering today, but also reflecting on the change that has happened as well. So there obviously have been a number of changes in regulation around how grid connections happen over the last year to try and tackle the grid capacity crunch. So there's been a lot of little different minor tweaks and changes here and there that have had big impacts. But again, pointing to some of the stats I gave out in the last episode, the queue has been growing so rapidly, at pace, that small changes just haven't cut it. The queue and the applications coming in have just massively swamped any of the small changes that could have been made. So this is fundamental reform that we're talking about. But just to recap, so we've had DNO connection milestones being enforced more stringently. So the DNOs starting to terminate connection offers. Some of the DNOs have hired external legal firms or different consultants to do that. We've had the transmission system operator bring in very strict milestones. So I think everybody's getting their milestones at a transmission level by the deadline. I think the deadline to kind of modify them was like the end of May. And then I think they expect receipt of the milestones shortly thereafter. I can't remember the exact dates.
And they'll be broadly similar to the DSO milestones, I'm assuming. Do you think they'll be?
I don't have them in front of me. They're actually quite a bit. There's a lot more detail on them, and they're a lot more strict. So, for anybody that's been in the DNO milestone, they haven't been as strictly by the book in terms of enforcing them in the past. Now they are getting a bit more strict on it, but it's not like a codified thing that the DNO absolutely has to stringently apply. The transmission milestones are like they are
they're going to be set in stone.
You don't meet it, you're out. There's particularly on the first lot of milestones around planning things, they are like super strict. Which could be that could
useful
be
to know for
separate podcasts. There's also some really big risks with the transmission milestones around. If you get penalised after your trigger date, you can still be liable for a lot of security, multi-million pounds. So you could be getting your connection offer removed plus build a lot of money. But look, in danger of going down a rabbit hole. So we're not here to talk about transmission milestones today. We're just referring to them as something else that's changed. The requirement for land rights for transmission applications has been brought in as well. That's another change. Technical limits, big initiative by the DNOs to basically say all this transmission stuff's taking too long. We need to do something for our customers to unlock some connection offers in the short term. So they basically kind of agreed with the transmission system operator, okay, well, look, you've already kind of signed off this amount of capacity at each of our GSPs. Let us just go and do our own thing within that. So technical limits has been a big thing. I know it's been quite frustrating and disappointing to a lot of people, but at the same time, it was kind of always going to be. It was a stick and plaster solution. Yeah, to just let the DNOs on, release whatever capacity they did have. But in the context of the size of the queues, it was never going to do. It was a temporary stick and plaster solution, in my opinion. Sorry if I'm offending anybody who spent a lot of time working. Like, fantastic initiative, don't get me wrong. Like, kudos to the DNOs who put a lot of time and effort into it. It's just one of those, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Oh, totally. And I think all these things have been people trying to move the needle a little just to allow things not to grind to a halt, where now we're getting into this reform piece. Actually should be moving the dial.
That's exactly it. So all these little initiatives have all maybe moved the dial a bit and unlocked a few, but in the context of the size of the queue, by definition, you're going to disappoint the vast majority of people because none of them were a silver bullet. We've had the SCR, which the significant code review, which changed up how DNO reinforcements are funded. So again, a lot of free reinforcement or funded reinforcement, but not all the time as our podcast last year.
Podcast covered that one.
A lot of caveats, but that was another big change. And also a lot more flexible connection options being brought in at distribution level too, with the whole transition to DSO, distribution system operator. So in the last year, looking back, when I sat down to actually sort of script out the podcast a bit, there's been so much change. It's been absolutely crazy.
Yep.
And now look, we'll get on to the topic we're here to talk about today. The year looking ahead is going to be like change squared again in terms of the pace of change.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think we'll get into timescales and all that good stuff when we go through this. But even those changes that have happened, we have seen all those changes come through in the last year. But even those small changes took time in terms of collaboration, going out to consult, all that good stuff that kind of takes that bit of time. But we've started to see we have started to see some of those small benefits. But that kind of sets up what we need to do in this big reform then.
Yeah. So just reflecting back, that there has been a lot of change, but that we'll talk about it now. That there's a lot more change to come, which makes it incredibly hard to keep up with all this stuff as well.
Well, how will it impact your customers in this change? What's driving it, or what's the heart of it?
Yeah, so let's get into connection reform with a capital C, if you like, if you want to call it that. This will be a big direct impact then to any directly connected transmission customers, but also any of the kind of larger customers at distribution level. But it will also be a massive indirect impact to pretty much anybody else then connecting at distribution level. So directly impacting for transmission customers, it's changing the fundamental rule set and how you go about a transmission connection. For the larger distribution customers as well, it fundamentally changes how the DNO talks to the transmission system operator when they're talking to them to get capacity, in layman's terms, for their distribution customers. So that process has all changed. So that's the whole kind of, if people's familiar with ModApp, project progression, Appendix G, just some of the industry lingo that gets thrown about for, basically what people are talking about with those lingo is how the DNO talks to the transmission network to assess transmission capacity or the impacts, or get sign off from the transmission system operator. So that's going to be totally changed. Changed with a new lovely acronym called DFTC, Distribution Forecasted Transmission Capacity. So again, we'll touch on that in a little bit more detail, or lack of detail probably. But yeah, so this will affect pretty much anybody connecting anything to the grid. Ideally, for the smaller projects, then at demand projects as well. Ideally, I'd like to think this should free up capacity and help them, help get more stuff connected across the UK ultimately. And for the kind of larger customers, they need to be more aware of a different regulatory landscape in terms of how they go about getting connected.
So it does kind of sound like a new process or a new set of rules that's going to come into
100%. And there's going to be so much regulation is going to have to change. So at the minute, and again, we haven't actually described what the new system looks like yet, but we'll come on to that. But at the minute, this has primarily been proposed through a CUSC mod, so CUSC, again, another acronym, which is basically the kind of rules that the transmission system operator operates by, and people who connect to the transmission system operate by. So it's kind of like a set of rules or governance. So National Grid have released their cost modification proposals, CMP, another acronym. It's 400 and something. I should actually had that number for the podcast. There's actually two modifications. So there's one for the whole new process to come in. There's a separate modification to be able to retrospectively apply it to the current queue.
Okay, well, that's an interesting,
which we'll touch on as well. But that I think is such a big topic that it's somewhere different in the CUSC. So we have that, but then that's going to have a lot of knock-on regulatory changes. So there's probably going to be changes needed to DCUSA, which is, again, another acronym, but that's effectively like the distribution kind of governance framework that governs how different people interact, between suppliers and DNOs.
Yeah, because you've got queues on queues here, haven't you? So you have to make sure there's a way of dealing with that.
So there's going to be so much regulatory change. We'll probably find it sway into different ENA policies and different things as well. So that's, anytime you go to change a lot of these regs, that means working groups, it means consultations, everything else. So we probably should just get into what does connection reform look like, rather than kind of talk. Yeah, I think we've probably outlined sort of what
we've had all the acronyms now and all the regulatory.
Well, there's
chat.
There might be a few more yet. So let's see. Okay, so what does the new kind of system look like as far as we know it? So basically, what the ESO has set out is effectively a gated process for any developers that may be familiar with the system in the Republic of Ireland, there is a lot of kind of similarity here, but there is some differences, and we'll touch on that actually. How does it look different? Because I know some of our listeners will be familiar with the Irish system. There is also a lot of deja vu in this, particularly for the likes of myself and yourself, in terms of when the transmission capacity became an issue in Northern Ireland as well, when we were working in a past life. So, a lot of the kind of industry consultation papers, proposal, it all reads very, very similar to stuff that...
We've been at a few of those events over time.
And it all reads very similar to all the same issues that were coming up in Northern Ireland several years back as well. So, again, for anybody listening that was involved in the kind of Northern Ireland connection change process, a lot of this will sound very familiar there as well, but obviously with some key differences. So running down through it then, moving to gate it process. So for transmission applications, you'll have gate 1 and gate 2. So gate 1 will open once a year. So you'll only be able to apply for transmission transmission application once a year. I think they're talking in around like Q1, Q2 or something like that. That'll all be subject to change, but key principle, a once a year application window, and then you'll get a gate 1 offer back. That's effectively an indicative holding pen offer. So you're not in a queue at this stage. You've got a bit of an indicative offer that says, okay, you'll probably connect here, could take this long, probably in around this much. You'll not be asked for any securities or anything at this stage. It's very much that's
a feasibility type.
Kind of, yeah. It looks to me like it's a bit of a budget offer, basically. That doesn't really mean a whole lot. And then effectively the key is then gate 2. When you qualify for gate 2, you then move into the queue proper, if you want to call it that. So this is the first ready, first connect. So qualifying for gate 2 is the first ready criteria, and as we'll come to gate 2 and meeting gate 2, that's
going to be
that's the cornerstone of all of this, and it's also the bit that
everybody will dispute if they
and it is still subject to detail. So the gate 2 criteria is probably the key item that still needs to be properly worked out. And
the reason for these gates, that's kind of like to allow like a batch process in terms of planning. Is that in terms of like the network planner?
Yeah. So effectively, gate 1 is a bit indicative. The gate 2, the idea is they will open gate 2 4 times a year, so quarterly. So you sit in gate 1, you're in your holding pen, and then they'll do a whip round every quarter. Well, they won't actually come and ask you. It's up to you to put your hand up and say,
"I'm ready to get in there."
I'm gate 2 qualified. Pick me.
Yep.
So you submit your gate 2 readiness application ahead of one of those quarterly gates. So when the gate 2 gate closes, using the word gate a lot here, they'll assess it to make sure it's competent, validate that you have met gate 2. They'll then spend, I think they're intended to spend about 6 months then, doing a holistic kind of network design for everybody.
Because that's where the efficiency comes, isn't it? Right. That's why there is a gate, because instead of building out every individual reinforcement, if you look at it in a batch, there's a cleverer way of doing this. You don't need as many lines. You don't need as much.
You look at it more strategically. Yep. So again, for anybody who's been involved in the Irish system, like bears a lot of similarity. So that they look at that. So say the first gate 2 in Q1 ends at the end of Q1, that they'll then be modelling the network through sort of Q2, Q3. They'll issue offers then after that. I think in the fourth
quarter of that,
the third quarter after the gate 2 closes,
and
then everybody will have their offer acceptance timescales, and then effectively that process gets run in parallel. Every quarter a new one of those processes starts. So one of the big things then is this has been retrospectively applied to the whole queue, and that wasn't the original intention, but because the queue has gone so far out of control, that's the add-on bit that they've said, well, we actually need to push this a bit further.
I suppose when you kind of think of, I know there's accepted offers out there, but a lot of it is like, they are kind of feasibility type. It's sort of nearly, I'm assuming it's like gate 1 into gate 2 then? Is that
so we've already had the 2-step offer process with National Grid,
Yeah.
so it's a little bit similar to that, where that first step process was a bit indicative in a way.
Yep.
So it's going to, there's bits of this is going to feel very similar. Anyway, yeah. So, but yeah. So that's the crux of it. I'm just conscious of time. I think we'll take a quick break now, and we'll come back after the break then to go through. There's a lot more detail. What happens, distribution offers.
what might be the criteria for
Yeah.
getting into gate 2, all that good stuff.
Yeah, retrospectively applying all this to existing queue, like, well, what might that mean or look like? Is it going far enough? How does it compare with the ROI system? And what's some of the key maybe issues that are going to need work through, and looking forward at timescales. So those are all the sort of things we'll come back after the break to delve into in a little bit deeper. And we'll also just give you some of our thoughts on what are the key things to look out for, what you might need to be considering at this stage if you are in that queue, if you're a distribution project as well.
Yes, that due diligence piece, isn't it?
Yeah. Okay, we'll just take a quick break. We will be back, probably very, very quickly with the second half of this episode.
Cheers.